Why do you have an over-reliance to hit a roadblock and your first instinct is, I need someone's help to get past the roadblock instead of debugging, searching, solving it?
Yeah. Fear is the mind killer, right? People have so much fear around doing the incorrect things. You build up these ways to solve problems that probably aren't the best way to solve problems. This is actually a really interesting question to tackle after we just talked about. Earlier in your career, you might have this mindset that it is, what is it to be an engineer is to like solve problems, write the code, but you don't think about all these edge cases, all these business use cases that you just mentioned, because it's really hard to gain that experience when you're just learning.
What's going on, everyone? We are back with another one. I am one of your co-hosts. My name is Danny Thompson. I'm the director of technology at a company called This Labs.
And I'm Noel, managing director of engineering at Resilient Coders and wonderful community member at 100 Devs.
I'm going to start this off with this. And we've kind of talked about this in the past. You know, we've talked about how, and this has been my belief well before AI was talked about mainstream. And it's that your syntax and the ability to create syntax and write syntax is not the reason why you'll be hired. This was my advice in 2019, in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. It's my advice even in 2025. Your syntax and the ability to write it is not going to be why you are hired. Your problem-solving set of skills will be the reason why you are hired and brought into a company, because that is what they're looking for. If they just need syntax every single day of the week, someone graduates from a boot camp, they learn how to code online, they graduate college, they learned on their own, whatever it may be, there's always somebody that can regurgitate syntax. Your syntax is just the delivery mechanism in which you are delivering a solution. And that problem-solving set of skills is the way you actually develop, deliver, create that solution. And this morning, I was tagged in a post, and I will read that post for everyone here. And I will even include this person's name. Kristen Martin is the one that wrote this post. And I really, really liked it. And so I will go ahead and read this because I think it applies. And it sparked me to write something, and it kind of sparked basically today's episode. And so they are a listener of the podcast, as we'll see in the post as well. So Kristen, you sparked today's episode idea. And so as of recording this, you wrote this 4 hours ago. So we're fast on the money.
Let's go.
When I was younger, my mom wanted to buy a Jeep Wrangler because she was the coolest. Joe Martin can vouch for this. Suddenly, I started seeing Jeeps everywhere. Of course, they had been there the whole time, but up until this point, I just didn't notice them. This week, the same thing happened to me with problem solving. I've always known it's the foundation of programming, but I hadn't truly noticed just how central it is until now. Here are a few signs from this week that reminded me to sharpen my problem-solving skills. First, Colt Steele's course on DSA. Before diving into coding, he emphasizes problem-solving using this classic book, How to Solve It. But in his course, Colt Steele does the hard work for us and breaks it down into steps. Restate the problem. Identify the inputs, define the expected outputs, label important pieces of data, a roadmap. This is what I needed. Then on my way to work, I was listening to the programming podcast, and Danny Thompson said, your syntax doesn't get you hired. Problem-solving set of skills does. That hit me hard. So if you're prepping for interviews by memorizing closures, ifs, don't forget what really matters, problem solving. I just have to say, pausing from that, Leon, we doing something, man. I'm glad we're having some kind of impact. And so I guess before I continue, like after saying all that and reading that to you, Leon, like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So first, they picked up on what I think is one of the most important things you could be doing during the interview process, which is also really funny because I spent yesterday on Discord with a big group of folks showing them that exact process that they just outlined. We call it PREP, parameters, returns, examples, pseudocode. It's the idea that when you're in a technical interview, it's not just about you solving the problem. That's great. Anybody can get through maybe solving the problem, but it's your communication and your collaboration. It's the demonstrating of your problem-solving ability that's also paramount when you're going through these technical interviews. And so right off the bat, I'm like, oh, they just have a different way of talking about what we call PREP. And so parameters, what's coming into, let's say you're building a function for the technical coding challenge. Returns, what are you giving out? Examples, keeping your interviewers honest. Have a set of examples, your test cases that are going to show that if you solved it, this is what you expect. And then your pseudocode. And that's where the problem solving comes in, right? You're communicating with your interviewer, you're collaborating, you're showing them that on the job, it's not about the syntax, like you said, but how can we digest this problem, show that I understand it? And I can't tell you the number of folks that get through interviews, even if the syntax is not 100%, because they've demonstrated that they can solve the problem. So I love having roadmaps. I love for folks that have never thought about programming as a set of systems you can employ, a way of thinking, and giving you some strategies to get that ball rolling so that you can develop your problem solving ability. I think that's a huge thing. And so I think a lot of people lack that very core thing that's going to make them be successful, not only as a programmer, but on the job search as well. So I'm glad we're talking about it. I think this could be really fun for folks to kind of start thinking about if they haven't already.
Yeah. So there's it took me a while to even improve my problem solving set of skills, right? Like a multitude of things. So number one, when it comes to problem solving, like you have to improve technically in order to start realizing things, right? But number two, it starts taking things from multiple scales, like especially when we're talking about programming or enterprise or things like that. It's like number one, if I'm being honest, what are the business use cases? Like, why are we think so even when I work with like junior devs, interns, etc., one thing that I constantly go to them is, why did we implement this solution? And I want them to defend it. I don't want them to defend it in like the sense of I'm interrogating them. I want them to defend it in the sense that we're trying to understand your thought process. I want to approach it because like if there's gaps in one area, I won't know that unless you tell me that. And so I won't know whether to teach you something, educate you on something, get something through in that regard. So for me, I want you to explain it, and maybe there's something that I've totally overlooked. That's completely possible, right? I want to learn too. And so when you implement a solution, like why did you implement it that way? And so for me, especially when it comes to code reviews, that's something that I often ask. Like I won't just put nit. Which is like a common code review term. You'll say nitpick, hey, we need to fix this, or info, etc. I often say question, and then I'll ask my question. And so like, can you explain this to me? Then we can jump in a call or something like that. Maybe it's easier to implement. Maybe you have background information as to why we implemented this strategy as opposed to that. But if your thing is, oh, well, this is just the first thing that I thought of, it fixes the problem. But then when we start having issues when it comes in regards to scaling. Like as of right now, maybe we have 10,000 visitors on the website that we're seeing on a monthly basis, and maybe the solution works for that. But what happens when we implement a new feature? What happens when we start working on this instead? Or what happens when we start building out a different solution in that regard? Like what do we do then? And so that needs to be the question. And like, what are you looking at a bigger, higher level as an approach to this? And so it kind of got me thinking, and I've used examples in the past, but one example that I want to approach is like coffee, right? And it's something that we're all understanding used to. Many of all have either had some brush with it, drank it, experienced it, or somebody that used it some way, shape, or form, right? So if I were to tell you to like make a cup of coffee, I'm pretty confident most of us could do this without really thinking too much. Like we all know how we like our coffee in some way. Maybe we don't like it at all. Maybe we love it. But we know how to make a cup of coffee. But what if I were to say, and you'd go through the motions, but what if I said like, oh, there's a way to optimize this process? Your first instinct will be, well, this is how I've always made coffee, right? So like, what am I going to optimize? Like, what am I going to change? Like, this is a very thorough process for me. But I was like, what if you did this process instead and it enhanced the flavor? That would be a discussion to have. Like, oh, well, I've never thought about it this way. Or I've tried it and I actually didn't like that flavor and I liked it this way. But what if I were to now say, what if you had a 7-year-old that wanted to go in the kitchen and help you make that cup of coffee? Your approach would drastically change, wouldn't it? You would start thinking about things that you probably didn't think about in the first process. Like, if when I said make a cup of coffee, did the word hot enter your mind the way it does when you have a 7-year-old? Because now you're like, well, the coffee coming out is going to be hot. So I got to make sure at that point of the process, they're washing their hands. Now your problem solving is expanding. You're starting to break it down at a different level. But what if we now took it one step further and then we said, business use case? How are we sourcing the beans? What are we doing during the roasting process? What if we're looking at this now saying we are sourcing the beans, we're roasting the beans, we're transporting it to the locations that we want. Maybe we want them to roast it in the location itself instead of having a outside roaster. So that way we can just maintain freshness to a certain degree. What are we discovering when it comes to the beans where it's like, oh, we used X process, and in that process, we found out the beans roast faster and it actually burns a little bit. Now it's totally changed the flavor profile instead of when we use Y process. And now Y process has a different flavor profile. Which profile do we prefer better? And based on that, what are we seeing customers like even more? That totally changed the entire process now. And so when you just start with something as simple as making coffee in your home to then expanding it to the business use cases, the level of problems and the path that you can go down completely changes. And so as you start considering that in your processes when it comes to, and this isn't just software development at this point, like this is business use case, this is any kind of level of problem solving. When you start taking this to your solutions, it's like, okay, I have to implement a search feature on our website. And so now, right now, the search feature is looking for all of the content that we make. So let's assume for a second that you're working at an enterprise level organization. And in that enterprise level organization, you have blog content, you have a sales funnel, you have a homepage, you have a newsletter functionality, etc. And so when you implement the search feature, maybe right now it's searching for all of the plans. So let's say, for example, someone's searching for something for their house and maybe you do repairs. And so you're like doing air conditioning repair as a search feature. It's pulling that up. But what if in the future we wanted our blog articles to be searchable in that regard? And so now you're saying, well, my search functionality that I thought about only implements this. How do I implement it for further components? These are architectural things that you need to be thinking about. And so just because you have a ticket in front of you that says implement this, you should be thinking about, well, how does this expand? How do we future-proof this, so to speak? I'll stop there, but Leon, you want to go?
No, I think this is an interesting phenomenon because folks that are earlier in their career might not know that this is a thing. And then folks that are later in their career, I feel like they're unhappy when they stop focusing on this as a thing. And I'll explain what I mean. So
hopefully you're liking that episode, and we'll get back to the conversation in a second. But first, a word from our sponsors. Financial literacy is important, especially if you are in a position where you are changing careers and income brackets. More income can create larger financial issues if you don't budget correctly. So this episode is sponsored by Lucas Casares, certified financial planner and founder of Level Up Financial Planning, where he specializes in serving early and mid-career tech professionals to help you take your financial confidence to the next level.
Danny and I have helped thousands of people level up in tech, often going from 0 to 6 figures careers, seen all kinds of mistakes. Level Up Financial Planning helps you gain clarity on all your finances. This includes prioritizing, managing employer stock, retirement planning, tax planning and preparation, college planning, and as a special deal for our listeners, you can get a complimentary meeting with Lucas. All you have to do is visit levelupfinancialplanning.com to find out more.
Lucas is awesome. A lot of people already checked it out from the previous episodes. Give it a check. Back to the episode.
Early in your career, you might have this mindset that it is what is it to be an engineer is to like solve problems, write the code, but you don't think about all these edge cases, all these business use cases that you just mentioned, because it's really hard to gain that experience when you're just learning. It's a big reason why I like the groups that you run, where folks can get real world experience, right? I think that missing component is the polish that a lot of folks coming right out of university or their learning process, they just don't have the frame of like how that's such an important part of the job and where probably a lot of the real work lies. And it's also where I think people just don't understand how big a part of the profession that is. And it's sad because you wind up with a lot of folks that focus on the wrong things as they're preparing for this career. And so if you're listening to this podcast and you're at the beginning of your career, you have to do the things that develop this skill so that you can be not only proficient in your job, but a value add to the teams that you're on. Like this level of thinking and problem solving is what turns you into a better coworker, a better employee, and being able to take on more responsibility, make these higher level decisions is what's going to lead to your growth and eventually, hopefully, promotion, plus a whole bunch of other things too. And then when I talk to a lot more senior folks, I think sometimes you can lose this perspective and focus just on the tickets and slowly, if you want, lose the bigger picture of the things that you're working and building towards. And then it can come monotonous. And there's so much fun and joy and thinking through. All right, yeah, I have to make a button, but what does this button impact? What do I need to do so that I can keep all these use cases in mind? And I think sometimes we get too caught lost in the slog and kind of forget how to pull these practices back in. So I think even if you're at the beginning of your career, the middle of your career, the wherever you're at, I think kind of refocusing and developing these skills is really, really important, especially if you care about continued growth, but also just like happiness and fun and the job as well.
So, I guess my question to you, and I think we all have opinions on this, but it's like, what would you suggest as ways for someone to improve the problem solving set of skills? Like, are there certain tools that you recommend, exercises, thought processes? What approach would you suggest to somebody? Like, maybe they're learning how to code, or maybe they are already working in tech. To be honest, there are definitely developers that can totally improve the problem solving set of
Yeah.
skills. Like, what are some of the recommendations you have there?
Yeah, I guess the first recommendation I have is that we live in a world of abstraction, right? And if you can slow down and peel back those abstractions, you can start to maybe think in ways that help you solve larger problems. So, one of the exercises I always work through with my students is quite a silly one, but I think it can be quite eye opening to a lot of people. And that is, we make a robot make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's a classic problem. A lot of folks that are going through CS training do this, but it's slowing down, thinking through, all right, if there's a robot in front of me, how do I command them to build this sandwich? How do they put the peanut butter on? How do they put the jelly? How do they move? How do they target the items? How do they have vision? How do they have all these things that we just take for granted in day-to-day life, but breaking those down, thinking through all the way to basic principles on how we can build up to these larger and larger systems is something that just day-to-day as humans, we don't have to do. We've already learned these things. We've already know how to process that the coffee machine is in front of us, so we just press the button. But the example you gave in the beginning is you can just take small moments of your day and use them as an exploration to think in a more grandiose way. Yes, I'm going to press this button on this coffee machine, but what did it take for me to get to this moment? How is this machine made? What was the cost to make this made? Where do you think these things were sourced from? How did these components come together? Where do these beans grow from? And I know it could sound like a silly exercise, but when you start slowing down and start thinking bigger picture and stop just kind of leaning into the abstractions, over time, you're able to carry that into your work as well. Yes, I have to build this feature, but why is this feature being built? Where is this coming from? What is the impact? What is the business value? You can start doing that same thing in your code. You can start doing that same thing in your work, and it pays off big over time. So that's kind of the first step I would recommend folks that are interested in kind of developing this skill is slow down, ask the bigger picture questions, remove the abstractions, and kind of play that why game that kids play. Like why? That's going to help develop that more critical thinking and more abstract thinking that's going to be helpful for you to start to solve bigger problems. So that's kind of the first thing I would think about.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I think about when it comes to improving solving skills, right? Reading more code. This is often why there's the adage where your first job in tech, you'll learn more in the first 6 months than you will maybe several years learning on your own. And even last night, we held a meetup. One of the people in there from our community, he landed a job at Verizon. And he's been there roughly 5 months. And even he said, Danny, I've learned things that I never even thought to Google. And I'm just blown away like where I'm at now versus there, which is like a great situation to be in, right? Oftentimes getting the introduction to larger code bases helps out. And so what's one way to do that? Open source projects. They're a phenomenal way to kind of read code. You don't have to contribute. You can if you want to. But I would often say contributing at a level where you can contribute meaningfully makes sense. And so if you're at a very beginner, it's probably not going to be the way. And I've often seen videos where people are like, oh, just go do documentation fixes, stuff like that. You can totally do that. But if your documentation fix is like a random period or comma, you're not really contributing. You're just looking for an easy contribution to put on your profile, which it's just not worth it. And to be honest, for maintainers, it's a headache to go through all those issues that have been submitted, like just for stuff like that. It's not worth it. So studying those projects, I think, is really, really meaningful. The other thing is, and I don't know why a lot of people don't put onus on this, studying system design. Like, there's so many useful resources out there. And there's one resource, I think they're called Byte Go. I actually get their emails. Byte Go. And this is not promotion. We're not promoted by them, anything like that. I just think they have some really solid PDFs and stuff like that where you can get introduced to the idea of system design. Now, are some of them really complex? 100%. That doesn't mean you have to start there. Start with something easier where it starts making sense and start graduating your way up. The other thing is there's so many documentations online when it comes to like flow diagrams and graphs and understanding why they're taking certain architectural decisions. I would go that way. The other thing is, again, it always goes back to one thing: community. Do you know how many meetup groups you can go to and just geek out with somebody who's a higher level dev and just be like, hey, I would love to understand better ideas around system design. Here's a project that I'm trying to institute. What ways would you do this? Having a strong background in system design, I think, only helps. And the reason why I even say this too, the very first job in tech that I got, every job that I've ever had, except for my last one, always had a technical interview, like DSA related. I've heard of people not having it. I've always had the opportunity to have them. I think based on the organizations that you go for, this is something that kind of weighs into the conversation. But I feel like as you start going for more enterprise level organizations, larger size orgs, it's part of the process. And I remember making it to the last round of the interviews, and I was asked a question which was a system design question. And luckily I had a very basic understanding of system design by chance, not even by studying it, because I definitely didn't study it at the time. And the question that I was asked was, let's assume for a second that I'm the CEO of an organization and that you are my lead architect, and I want to make a competitor to YouTube. How would you do it? And I was like, that's all the information that you're giving me? Like, that's it? That's all I have to go off of? And he's like, yep. And I was like, well, I'm going to ask a couple follow-up questions because it only makes sense. And he's like, well, I'm not going to answer them. And I was like, well, that sucks. And I was like, I don't know how to architect this. And so what I started doing, which is pretty much the reason why I got the job, but he threw me a curveball, which I'll explain in a second. And I was like, well, and I'm a very big believer in this. If you follow me for any kind of time, you know this is one of my biggest pieces of advice. In a technical interview, you think out loud. And as I was doing this, I was literally thinking out loud. It was a word vomit of things. Well, if we want to consider the customer experience, we would utilize this. And if we wanted to optimize for business acquisition, we'd utilize this. And we were thinking about ad revenue because this is a factor of YouTube. Like, we would think about this process. And as I'm talking out loud, what I didn't know in the moment was he was taking notes and he really liked it. But what's funny is that hour-long interview, we're at minute 50 is when he asks me this question. The entire interview, there's a smile on his face. At this time, the smile disappeared. And in my mind, I said, I'm bombing this interview so badly. And what I didn't know was, as he was taking notes, there was a P0 prod issue, and he was getting Slack messages about it at the same time. And that is why the smile disappeared. I was freaking out internally. I'm like, oh, I totally bombed this. I was like, you can't tell me I went through 4 rounds of interviews. Everybody loved me. And one random question about YouTube cost me this whole thing, man. But system design and having some knowledge on it would totally help out. And so I would advocate for that in this regard.
Yeah. I think for folks that are trying to get started with system design, some of the resources I would recommend, whenever you Google system design, there's the system design primer. It's a GitHub repo. It's a really great early introduction. It's going to give you all the things that you could think about. And then one of my favorite, again, not sponsored or anything like this, is Exponent. If you just do system design Exponent on YouTube, what I love is they show you real system design interviews. And so you can watch some mock interviews of people going through it, different high level stuff, kind of like you said, how would you build YouTube? How would you build Facebook? Like these like high level system design conversations. And what you see in that is what people think about, right? For a lot of folks maybe listening, might not ever heard of like thinking about business value, right? And so when you watch a few of those, you go, oh, these are the things people think about. These are the problems people run into. These are the things they're trying to solve for. These are all the extra things that you have to think about when you're building larger systems. And I think you're kind of in the dark until you're either in a company that has those real problems, or you try to consume that type of content. And so highly recommend, if you're earlier in your career, you are what you consume, and you can get access to a lot of this information through these resources and even just your daily practices too. Reading Hacker News for 10, 15 minutes a day can change the whole scope of your career. All the languages you get exposed to, the projects, the way you think about things, it all changes, and that all molds your problem solving ability, because the sphere of what you understand and the things you think about changes. And so I would really push people to grow in that regard and consume that level of content too.
Yeah, I also give a +1 to Hacker News, but it's not even just Hacker News. It's when you surround yourself with influences, like, you're going to pick up those things. So when you look at Hacker News, for example, you're surrounded by a bunch of technologists that are focused on something, right? And so you're consuming all the information. You get the same. I won't say you get the same, but you get a very close quality of ideas when you're around a community. And, like, to give you an idea, last night we did a meetup, right? The whole meetup was around JavaScript. So many people in the audience were saying, I just learned something new just by showing up. And so stuff like that, like, you're surrounded by a bunch of devs, you're going to pick up something. The example that I always give in this regard is, when you surround yourself with your influencers, you're going to pick up something. So when you surround yourself with devs, maybe you hear about something that they implemented at work, or maybe something that they experimented with, or something new that they learned. If you surround yourself with chefs, it's really hard not to walk away with a new recipe. Same way here, if you surround yourself with devs, it's really hard to walk away not knowing something new. And so maybe every single conversation you don't pick up something, but maybe there's a couple conversations here and there where you do. And so by you being active in a meetup group or community or Discord or something like that, you're going to pick up. And you don't have to join mine or Leon's. There's millions out there. Like, go find the community that you really mesh well with and that you want to be a part of. It doesn't have to be a group of 10,000, 20,000. It could be a group of 5. It could be a group of 10. As long as it's feeding your flame, that totally makes sense to me. But, like, if you find yourself in a conversation where no one is motivated, no one's doing nothing, no one's progressing, why are you in there? Like, and this was me. Now I'm starting to think of, like, Danny back in, like, age 25. Do something today that the you in 5 years from now is going to look back and say, man, thank you so much for making that decision. And I constantly think about that when I'm auditing my time, my effort, what I'm putting like, resources into. I'm always saying, like, the Danny at 25, please do something the Danny at 30 is going to be happy for. And then, then I'll even start even slow. Like, the Danny at 28, please do something Danny at 30 is going to be happy about. Danny at 30, please do something the Danny at 32 is going to be happy about. And now, like, it's like, Danny at 30, please do something the Danny at 35 is going to be grateful for. And then now the Danny at 35, like, please do something the Danny at 40 is going to be grateful for, and so on and so forth. Because when I do get to these ages, I'm like, man, I'm so happy I took that decision there. Like, this totally made sense. But sometimes we're so focused on, like, how we're getting through several moments in time, which you should be focused on, don't get me wrong. But it's like, sometimes you got to think bigger too. It's like, okay, what is my 6-month goal going to be? And is this going to be beneficial to me a few years from now? And so sometimes we're just so small in our thought process, because a lot of us think we're invincible, time will never waste, and all that good stuff. But the reality is, the last 10 years of my life had disappeared. It's totally gone. And I'm living in a moment now where my son, he's 11 going on 12 going on 55, right? Like, one thinks he knows everything. And I'm looking at him, like, I have pictures of every single night going to bed. He would walk to the living room from his bed, to his bed to go to sleep. But every night he'd want to hold my hand going in there. And so now he's at a stage where his hand is damn near the same size as mine. And I'm like, what is going on? How did this happen? Like, I remember when his finger, like, he'd hold my finger and that was enough. And now he's grabbing my hand, trying to, like, squeeze it to show dominance. And I, like, man, do I have to remind you who I am? Like, hold on now. It just goes to show that time flies. And so it's weird. It's cliche. It sounds old. I heard it when I was growing up, and I would say the same thing, like, oh yeah, they looking back on the fond days. But I'm telling y'all, our time on this earth is so limited. It's so small. Do something that you're going to actually be grateful for in the long term, and stop thinking so short term on everything.
I can. Now I understand why the jiu-jitsu came into play. You got to make sure you can stay on top. But no, I think
Man,
this is beautiful advice. I think you need to keep taking the risk to keep making that progress. I know so many folks that come from our communities. That's what they're looking for. They're trying to make that transition into a more meaningful career, and it comes from just doing those kind of brave tasks every year. Like, what can I do to make that future self proud? There's also something that came up that I've just been reading this to all of my students because I think it's really important, especially in this day and age when we're talking about, all right, you can consume exponent YouTube videos and learn about system design. You can consume hacker news and pick up something new. You can go to meetups, pick something new. And so I love this book, Steal Like an Artist, one of my favorite books. And there's paragraph or two that I think just everyone needs to hear. And it really speaks to my background too. But this is the author speaking, and then I'm going to read a quote from Jay-Z. You are, in fact, a mashup of what you choose to let into your life. You are the sum of your influences, right? And so who you listen to, like what you bring into your sphere is what you become. And so surrounding yourself with community, with good folks that want to push forward is one of the most impactful things you can do for yourself, your career, your life. And then I love this quote from Jay-Z. I'm going to read it real quick. We were kids without fathers. So we found our fathers on wax and on the streets and in history. We got to pick and choose the ancestors who would inspire the world we were going to make for ourselves. And so you get to make that choice each day. And you might be scrolling through this clip on TikTok, but maybe we should pop over to Hacker News and take a little control over the influences you put in your brain, because it definitely affects the outputs and it affects your ability to think about things, to solve the problems, to think in new ways. And I think that's such an important piece of your development that I think we're just kind of losing in a more kind of busy world.
all right, I was gonna say something after that, but let's go ahead and stop right there and let's do it. Ask Daniel Leon.
Sounds good. All right. Got a good one today. My boss told me I need to be more independent. What should I do?
That's a good one. There's a lot that can go into this. I can tell you, I've had this conversation with people as well, um, where it's an over-reliance on others. And I'll actually give you an example. I had a one-on-one call with this person several times now. We don't work together, but they were needing help. And they have been a junior dev in an organization for 2.5 years. For a lot of the time, they admit themselves like they were just coasting. They really didn't learn a lot during that time period, which is terrible. And they put them in a position where when they reached out to me, they basically said, my job is on the chopping block, and I've basically been given one task, and they said this task will determine whether I get to keep my job or not, which is like a terrible situation to be in. And they basically said, as I was asking questions, the lead engineer said to me, it's very concerning that you're asking these kinds of questions 2.5 years into this role. They were definitely shocked. They were taken aback. And the lead engineer said, I will spend one session with you answering questions, whatever it is that you need. I will also be judging some of the questions that you're asking. But I'll make sure that you have the answers that you need to perform this task. They started freaking out even more now. Like, what do I ask? Because they're judging the answers. But it's like 2.5 years in, I would even expect a certain level of knowledge to exist. So like when you're asking about like some of the certain basic APIs that your code base is using on a regular basis, you should know that answer. You should actually know that within the first 6 months, much less 2.5 years, right? And so to ask that, and the task that they were given was literally building like a 3-step breadcrumb navigation bar. And based on each step, the questions change, but it doesn't re-render the entire page. This is not the craziest task in the world that I expect somebody to be able to implement. And they were freaking out. And the results ended up being like they were able to pass that task. And they still, as far as I know, I haven't checked on them in a long time, but after those calls, they were given another task and able to keep their job. They rose to the occasion. But in our calls, this is something that I also mentioned, like, why do you have an over-reliance to hit a roadblock and your first instinct is, I need someone's help to get past the roadblock instead of debugging, searching, solving it.
Yeah.
We will almost refuse to do the research. And one prime example of this is even in our Discord yesterday, a question was asked, hey, I've got this error in Expo. I don't know what to do. I've never used Expo, but the error literally said, oh, it can't find a module that's called sign it. And I was like, did you read the error? Because it's literally saying it on the first line, it can't find this module. So did you look through that? Now, I'll be the first one to say, even as a beginner, I was terrified of reading errors. I didn't know how to go through it, But you need to start pushing yourself to at least skim it. Where are the words that you do understand? What can I ascertain from this? Errors have improved dramatically over the last several years to where you can read one and actually understand what's going on. Don't be intimidated because it's in the color red. Read it. Go through it, and you'll start becoming more independent. I will say that if your boss is being generous enough to tell you that, you should be very grateful to take that information and be like, I should start looking at this, because they don't normally say that out of nowhere. So maybe you're over-relying on your senior devs. If you're a senior, maybe you're over-relying on other devs to kind of get you out of jams. But I would say if you're being told you need to be more independent, you should audit the actions that you're taking and figure out why are you so over-reliant on others in order to help you finish or complete a task.
Fear is the mind killer, right? People have so much fear around doing the incorrect things, doing it wrong, that it can lead to developing these supports that you don't need, right? Where you build up these ways to solve problems that probably aren't the best way to solve problems. This is actually a really interesting question to tackle after we just talked about. And so by the time you're 2 years into a role, you should be only going to your peers for help with things that you can't find anywhere else, right? Like, if you can take that error message in Google, you should have already done that. If you could have asked GPT that thing, you should have already asked. You should have been on Stack Overflow. You should have been in your code base. You should have been reading the docs. You should be doing all these things before you get to that point to where you have to kind of talk to someone else. And as someone who's working with you, I'm going to assume that you've done all those things, and now we can work together from a different starting point. And so I think for a lot of folks, they kind of have fear in getting to that point to where they can take those tasks on and get to that point, and they've built up this reliance on just asking first. By the time you come to ask me a question, I would expect you've done all of those things. You've tried every problem-solving ability. And then, all right, now we're in novel territory, and that's where we can work together. So if you're not doing that, that's the first major step. Earlier in your journey at the role, you can kind of say, hey, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Is that okay? And the other thing you have to be doing is documenting everything. So when you do ask these questions, you don't have to ask them again. Even if it's just for yourself, even if it's the process to how you got to the solution, because even sometimes you might be getting different kinds of errors, but it's still kind of the same thing you're going to have to do to fix it. And so I think really good documentation, really doing all the debugging and troubleshooting steps on yourself first, and then only escalating when it's really something that is beyond your scope of like knowledge or control or whatever. If you do that, you start to treat your coworkers a little more fairly, you know, like that makes more sense. And so I feel like if you're in this spot, maybe you haven't done those pieces yet, I would implore you to do that. And then you'll probably be in a better spot.
I think that's good advice. All right, y'all. That's another one in the books. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. You could have listened to any podcast in the world. You decided to hang out with us. It means a lot to us. If you enjoyed this podcast, you know, we always ask, please drop a like on it. I see the Spotify likes going up every single time. I see the Apple Podcast likes going up every single time. I see the YouTube likes going up every single time. We thank y'all for that, because that's kind of what it keeps us going, if we're being completely honest. We're constantly auditing, like, do people really like this? And then we see posts like that from Kristen, where it's like, I guess people really are engaging with it and liking it. So y'all, thank you. We'll see you on the next one. Bye, everybody.
Peace.